Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second ever Fireside Chat. And today we have Brian Balfour as our guest speaker. Brian doesn't need much introduction, but just so everyone understands his background, Brian is the founder and CEO of Reforge, a professional development startup for experienced practitioners. He's also a venture partner at Long Journey Ventures and a growth advisor investor in many high growth startups like Loom and Wonder School. Previously, Brian was the VP of growth for new products at HubSpot, including the CRM, Sales Hub, and more. He also started multiple VC-backed companies in the past and has one of the best newsletters out there you can find on growth, which is a must-read for anyone working in growth or product in general. So Brian, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And the format for this fireside chat is going to be 30 to 40-minute moderated Q&A, but for the last half of the event, we're going to open up for audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, you can keep it until the second half of the event. So Brian, to start out with, you're considered one of the early pioneers of growth. What was your first exposure to the discipline? And how was your experience like running growth as a founder and also as VP of growth at HubSpot?
Yeah, so my story is actually very similar to a lot of the other like early people into this discipline. I mean, so the first ever like true quote unquote growth team was started at Facebook, and then there was a whole wave of people that were essentially created during the way when Facebook opened up their platform, and social gaming became like a big boom. And so if you look like at a lot of people's background who are in growth leadership roles today, they probably spent some time in that world at a company like Zynga, Playdom, like something of that nature. And so the interesting question is like, why? And the reason is that for those of you who did not experience that time period, it was crazy. It was the absolute wild, wild west, where Facebook would like open up these like APIs to access their hundreds of millions of users with very little rules, and you could do whatever the hell you wanted with them. And as a result, it created this perfect environment of where you had these applications that could go viral in a very short period of time. It was driven by these like technological like inputs, like using APIs, and they were amplified by really understanding the user psychology of the users and like why they were doing actions they were doing. That's especially amplified in like a gaming type of environment, where these like user psych principles are kind of used as used to like just drive massive amounts of engagement in terms of, you know, completion and rewards and like all of these types of things. And so it was just this perfect like environment, and it was incredibly competitive. Sorry, that was the other thing that I mentioned. It was crazy competitive. And so you just had this perfect environment where all of these things came together in a very short period of time, where a lot of people were just like forced to learn these things. And that was it. That was it for me. Our company pivoted into the social gaming ecosystem about, I don't know, maybe like 6 months to a year in. And there was like nobody in our organization that knew any of this stuff. And so of course, like one of your jobs as a founder is just like, you take on the stuff that nobody else knows how to do in the organization, and you just like figure it out. And that's kind of what happened like with me. And so like, I just like dove in and like figured out these APIs. There was a lot of these early platforms that would release like these rudimentary versions of their paid ad platforms, and you could like figure out how their ranking algorithms by running like a few tests. And so it was just a lot of that, just really like fast trial and error, where you had really quick feedback loops just because of the volume that you were dealing with. So you could just learn in just a very, very short period of time. So yeah, it was just nutty, the things that you could do back then that would like 100% not fly today. And yeah, ended up being bad for the user experience, but it was certainly good from a learning experience on my side. Last note on this, there was like all sorts of like, just to tell you how crazy, there was all sorts of like back deal like trading going on, people like forming friendships with some of the developer relationship people at Facebook who would get early access to certain APIs to have a competitive advantage. The whole thing was bonkers in hindsight, but for some reason seemed so normal like at the time. So yeah, it was fun time, but that was kind of where it was all started, and that's why you see so many growth leaders today. Now, taking that into HubSpot, that was a total 180. That was completely different, applying it to B2B in a larger company environment, all sorts of things. But the foundational lessons still held true, and I'm happy to talk about that transition to HubSpot more if that's what you want to go deeper on next.
Yeah, at the time when you joined HubSpot, B2B growth was not very established. No one knew how to do B2B growth, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it also depends on like how you define growth, and growth is defined so differently these days and all that kind of stuff. But the big there's two huge transitions that I entered HubSpot with. So at the time, it was about a couple years before we went public. To set the stage, company had one product. It was the marketing product, and the company was probably like, I don't think we were just at 100 million ARR, but we were pretty close when I joined. And so the company, the executive team, JD Sherman and some of the others that were there before me, went through this whole exercise of like, hey, we once we go public, like we don't want our growth to stagnate, because that was kind of what had happened to most Boston tech companies. You could see their like growth chart and it would all hit an asymptote. And then you could like literally point to where on the graph to where they went public. And so the team really tried to answer the question, like, we want to grow 50% year over year for the next 5 years. Like, if we do that, what does that mean in terms of revenue, customers, like all of these things, like 5 years from now? And then let's work backwards to say, well, like, do we think our product, our growth motion, like all of these things like get us there? And the answer was no to them. And so a few things became very clear at the time, that they had to start planting seeds for what in Reforge we call like product market fit expansion. And those seeds for them at the time were one, international expansion. Two was establishing new product categories, so beyond the marketing product. And three was shifting the company from a sales and marketing led motion, because they felt like that was going to hit saturation, to a more product led growth motion. And so I was deeply involved in the latter two, not the first, not international expansion. And so we had the luxury of like applying all of these growth principles in new product categories and like kind of like new products within the company, which made it easier. Had we probably tried to do that on the big monstrous machine that had already been going, it would have been much harder. Having the advantage of doing it on smaller, earlier products led us to be able to do a lot more experimentation and try out a lot more things that probably wouldn't have flown on the other products. And just I had room for a lot more failures in that way. And so shifting that into the company was definitely a hard problem, but we had some like things working for us. But at the end of the day, it was the same foundational principles. Like, we are trying to get an individual to adopt the product. And specifically, we are trying to get them to adopt the product in a way that is very touchless from like a human perspective. So not a lot of like sales people involved. And as they use the product, they in some way, shape, or form expose the product to other people. Those were like the core foundational principles that we brought in, along with like the experimentation methodology. And that's what led to like some of the things in the free HubSpot CRM, what's now called the HubSpot Sales Hub. We had it named something different at the time, and a couple other products. Now, many years later, they took all of the not many years later, but like 4 years after I started, they started taking all of the lessons learned on those products and shifting them back into the core of the company. And that was like its whole thing as well. So yeah, that process looked The process was very different, but a lot of the same fundamental underlying learnings.
That's awesome. Yeah, we're going to come back to this topic of B2B SaaS companies going from 1 million in ARR to 1 billion later, and what are some lessons learned. But very curious, after HubSpot, why did you decide to start Reforge? What was the impetus and what's your vision for the company and the industry?
Yeah, there's the short story and like the long story. So the short story, the very short story is that that my team wanted to do a bunch of professional development stuff. I tried to figure out what to recommend them. I couldn't find anything. And then I was like, and then I looked at our L&D budget and realized that like less than 30% of it was being used. And it wasn't just my team, it was like all the teams. And I've now found that that's true across a bunch of companies. And so it wasn't due to lack of desire or lack of budget, it was just lack of solutions out there that kind of fit the needs. And so that led me to think about trying to develop something on the side, just like kind of what I had learned through those phases of my career I just talked about. And as I was thinking about doing that, I realized, I found out that Andrew Chen who was working on growth at Uber at the time, who also learned a ton in the social gaming ecosystem, which is how I knew him. So it all comes back to that. It was thinking about something similar, and so we just kind of combined forces, put together a super embarrassing MVP, and that had just way like instant product market fit. The embarrassing, and so which was very different than my first couple companies, which very much felt like pushing a boulder uphill. This one felt like the boulder was rolling downhill right from the beginning. So that was like really like the thing that led me to go try to pull on that thread a little bit. But historically, like I think for those thinking about founding companies, like there's three things that you need to get aligned, and that's the timing, the people, and the idea. And those three things are actually really hard to get to align all at the same time. And so I had done an education company before where I had learned about a ton about education and learned a ton about content creation. I personally had been interested in, at that time, I tried to get that company to pivot to the professional development space. So I had learned already a little bit about the professional development space. I had the unique like contextual knowledge of having like worked on growth, which was like in demand topic. So there was like all of these elements that kind of combined where the timing was right, the people was right. I solo founded, meaning like I had the unique capabilities to execute on the idea, and I was passionate about the idea. And so like all of those things kind of came together, which is what led me to which is what led me to Reforge. But yeah, it's really hard to get those things all together.
Where do you think the industry is going, and what kind of future are you creating?
Okay, so one of my pet peeves about the education industry and professional development is that we all tend to like refer to it in its entirety. And just like any good monstrous market, there are so many different segments of that damn market with so many use cases. And so when people, I see a lot of articles written out there being like giving just like blatant advice about professional development and education. You can't do that. People are solving, there are different segments of market solving for different needs. Specifically, what we solve for is what we call the messy middle. It's the part of your career that between getting that individual contributor role all the way up to like VP. So we're not helping, somebody get a job. We're not helping somebody like transition careers, from like Procter and Gamble into tech or anything like that. We are focused on the audience who have a job, they're on a path, they just kind of want to go down that path, faster. And so for us, where there's a lot of things that we think about, but there's a few things that we think about, which is that we think that like the best products in the world kind of tap into how somebody experiences a problem in the real world and like augments it, improves it in some way, shape, or form. And so, one thing that everybody loves to talk about is how professional development is ongoing, it's continuous, we're supposed to always be learning, right? All these things, but none of the solutions really like modeled that experience, right? Everything's typically like these one-off courses, separated from your work, separated from the context of your work, not really tied to the meaningful problems. They're like teaching like these skills in isolation with examples that don't really like resonate with you. You finish the program or the course, and then like you're done, right? Like you're disconnected from that experience as you go back to try to apply it. And so for us, like we're going through this major transition from historically doing these cohort-based programs, which we will still do because we still think there's advantages of those. But how do we combine that with experience that like lives with you and ebbs and flows with you as you go back to your company, you're executing, you're discovering new business problems that you need to solve, and you need to find new people, new knowledge to tackle those things. And so treating like professional development much more as like a consumer product versus a B2B product that is sold in like tops down within the organization. So that's like one of the main vectors we think on, but there's a bunch of other things that I think are going on in the space right now. I think we're going through a certification bubble where everybody, every course, every SaaS company, everybody is like offering a certification of some type. And as a result, like all of them start to lack meaning in any way, shape, or form. So there's a whole question of like, how do people, like, what is a better way to signal what you are capable of as a person than like like a badge on LinkedIn? And there's still a ton of, there's still like a crazy amount of work to be done there. And so, and the other thing is just like, and last thing is just like, I think we've gotten in our specific space, we've gotten obsessed with what people have labeled the skills economy. And the challenge with this is like, I'm sure all of you have a story like this at some point in your career, but my story was like, I took 3 years of comp sci in high school, and I just got very good at doing what I needed to do to get the grade, get the AP test, get the college credits, like all that kind of stuff. And then I tried to take like a comp sci course in college, like a year later. And like, I got my ass handed to me. Like I dropped out of that class in like a week because I was like, okay, like I should, like, I didn't retain any of this thing. I should not be here. But it wasn't until like 2 years later where I was like, my friend and I had this idea for internet company. And I picked up like a PHP MySQL book. I remember it was this big black and yellow book. And I learned how to build something in 2 weeks. And the difference between that is like, it was, I had uncovered the problem that I was interested in, that I had a meaningful connection with first. And then I learned the skills that I needed to solve that problem. And what the skills economy and this whole thing it started to lead people to just like collecting skills, like they're collecting, badges on a Boy Scout, like sash or whatever they call it. But it doesn't matter if you have a whole collection of skills if it's like completely disconnected from how you actually solve these problems in the real world. And unfortunately, like that's what most of these like learning environments are built around. So the general theme is just like, how do we connect like how people actually experience these things in the real world to like our actual product experience? And we just think there's like a lot of work to do on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think based on my experience, that's where I think education is going to best help you with execution as well. So you've definitely had a very successful career. What is the single most important thing that unlocked most of your career success?
I don't know if I consider it successful yet, but maybe like one day at the end, I will consider. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I actually tweeted about this like a week ago or something. I was surprised at the reaction I got from it. And it came from a session within Reforge. I can't remember the exact question somebody had sent me, but I started to reflect on it, which was that a turning point for me was when I personally discovered like how I do my best work. And so let me kind of explain like what I mean by that. So I would say like in my mid to late 20s, I would constantly get frustrated. I would like sit in these meetings with other people who I thought were really talented. and we'd be like trying to like riff live on like some problem or some solution. And I just never felt like I contributed in the way that I was fully capable of. And I could just never figure out why. And it wasn't until that I was 30 that I realized that just the way that my brain works is that I'm what I call a simmerer. I like to simmer on things. And the way that I like to simmer on things is through writing. So like I sit down and I like to write out my thoughts. And that gives me the opportunity to make new space for new thoughts, start to see patterns, start to see structure in things. And so it wasn't until then where like I started approaching all of my work, knowing that and using that tool as a way to like contribute better and solve problems in a like more structured way. And then once I started to figure that out, I started to like design my entire environment around it. So the other thing I learned was I was a morning person. So started to get up early, start to learn like what my morning routine was, block off my calendar between 8 and 12 so that I have time to write and think through these problems, and approach like the meetings and the rest of the day. And so there's a lot of these things of like how you do your best work. And I think they're different for everybody. And um, and I think it's interesting of like, I think a lot about like how maybe like Reforge can help people figure this out for themselves in some way, because that's kind of what changed for me. But if you can figure that out and then you can start to design your environment around it, and that's just your environment's like the people that you work with. Like this is something that I interview for now for people who I'm going to work very closely with to understand like 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 are we going to be able to like jam well together, like do we operate on a similar cadence or not. But yeah, once you start being able to design and control your environment around it, that was like a huge that was a huge lever for me. That also led to the second biggest lever, which was blogging and like building my first personal brand. And to be fair, like I actually started blogging before I figured this stuff out. And so a lot of people like to talk about building your personal brand, and it is important. And the reason, it can create a lot of leverage. And the reason it creates leverage is that it creates optionality. And when you have optionality, like in terms of choices of your next thing, or it like helps you meet people a lot easier, or it helps you get into conversations a lot of times that you otherwise might not when you're not like putting your work out there. And so, but the problem is like people just kind of they approach building personal brands, I think, incorrectly. They 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 start by just like writing on like a bunch of generic stuff, or so like I don't know, like let's say you're like 3 years into your product management career and you want to start building your product, your personal brand, and you just start writing about like general product management. The problem with that is that there's tens of other thousands of people out there writing about that same thing, and there's a lot of people who have way more experience than you about that thing. And so instead, it's like, well, where can you start that feels like a little bit more unique? And for me, like I started writing in like the early 2000s around social networking, when social networking was new, like it's not new anymore. But just writing, and the way that I approached it and the stuff that I was writing about was, it wasn't like I had any like like just like world amazing thoughts. It was just that I was one of the few people who was not only like trying to learn about it, but also putting it out there in the world of like what I was learning. And so I encourage, like when I talk about this with people, I encourage like to find something similar as the starting point. And then you can sequence into talking about the broader, wider, more generic topics that help you kind of like broaden that. And so I think some like recent things that I've seen people build personal brands around, even though they're very earlier in their career, are things like NFT, creator economy, a bunch of the new stuff that's going on there. So anyways, but that's the second biggest thing that has created a ton of impact. It's how I met my first investors for my first company. It's how I met my co-founders of my second company. It's how I got the job at HubSpot, and how I had previously met the companies. And it's what gave us the initial customer set for Reforge. So it like contributed to every single step along the way, actually.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was about to ask you what advice you have for people who are thinking about it, but I think you already answered that question. So maybe we'll skip that one.
Well, I think the second, to the extent that people are interested, I'll give one other tip out there, and then we can go deeper in the Q&A if you want, which is that you if this is something that you're interested in doing, is like another approach to write about something is people. Once again, there's this pressure that you always have to generate some like mind-blowing, like unique insight in the world, and I think that's what creates like what stalls people from actually doing this. I actually think most people could just start very simply by writing about like a problem that they've solved in their career or work, and they just write the story and show the work, right? So they say, hey, like the problem came up with this, and it's like this is what we noticed. So then we started to approach the problem this way. These are some of the things we went to find the solution. This ended up being the solution. If I had to do it all over again, here's what I would do differently, right? Like those types of things not only will help you like synthesize like your experience and stuff, but are actually pretty compelling to other people. And then the other tip would just be overinvest in the first few things that you put out there. And the way to get attention on them is what I used to do is I would create a list of like 30 to 40 people, close contacts. I'd email them beforehand and be like, hey, like I'm trying to get this thing going. I'm gonna write 2 to 3 amazing things on this topic just to help me get started. Like I'd really love you as part of this journey if you could just help share it when I send it out. And what that did is it got them like bought in, knowing that I wasn't going to ask them to share this thing out every single time I wrote something. They knew I was putting a lot of work into it. I was bringing them along for the journey. And what that helped do is just like help kind of like provide a spark essentially. And then things can start to take over from there. So, it comes back to like do things that don't scale if this is something that you want to think about investing in.
Awesome. Thanks for the tips. I think they're super actionable. Now, switching gears to talking about growth and strategy, you mentioned that different people define growth very differently these days. So how do you define growth? And what are some common misconceptions that you've seen on what people think growth teams do?
Well, I think first of all, I think the definition of growth is past the point of no return, meaning like I don't think there's like any like clarification that can be done at this point. It's just people are going to call growth whatever they want to call growth. So to that extent, I think like I think we're done trying to define exactly what it is. In Reforge, we classify 4 types of product work. There's feature product work, there's growth work, there's scaling work, and there's product market fit expansion work. And so the way that we draw the line is that feature work is specifically about is specifically around building new features that deliver on like the core value prop or like an adjacent problem to your core value prop. Growth work is about and Casey Winters was the original to define this, is like how do you connect more people to those features and those core value props in a larger and larger way. And so that can happen through by acquiring more people, getting people to build the habits on the product, getting more people to build the habits on the product. Once they've built the habit on the product, how do they build habits on other parts of the product? And then how do those habits, once again, lead you to essentially acquiring your next set of customers? So growth work to me is really about understanding and mapping out all of these pathways, both in a qualitative way and a quantitative way, and then pulling the levers to basically improve those pathways. Now, the tricky part about this is that the tools used to improve these pathways are pretty multifaceted. And this is where most of the mistakes come in, right? One way to essentially improve these pathways is to reduce friction, typically referred to as optimization work, right? And that is 100% a tool that you can use, but a lot of people who kind of over-index in this area lead to local like maximization, and so that gives like growth a certain reputation around around that type of work. But the other way that you can actually improve these pathways is by what we call adding good friction. So in these systems and in these loop dynamics, sometimes it is better to put a user through a higher friction experience, because that leads to some downstream higher quality experience for the users, which makes the whole system better as a whole. And so in systems thinking, this is just commonly referred to as like second order effects. You have to be able to understand what are the second order effects of the things that you are doing, so that you can like think about the system as a whole. But another tool that you can use is sometimes building entire new features in order to facilitate and improve these pathways. So that's the other mistake, is a lot of growth teams get caught in just doing like the small tweaks, either to remove friction or add friction. But sometimes there is like fundamental, there's basically fundamental like new things that you need to build to unlock the next layer of growth. And finally, while you are doing all of this, you have to do all of the scaling work in parallel. So building the infrastructure and tools to enable things like, I don't know, like personalization or lower friction experimentation, or getting access to more data more quickly so that you can answer more questions and implement more things, like all of these types of things. So anyways, this is how I think about, this is generally how I think about the bucket of work. I think one of the biggest mistakes we've made in product management, or not mistakes, but one of the things I think looking forward is, I think product management will go through a wave of specialization that other functions have already been through, but for some reason product management hasn't gone through, right? Like we have one type of product manager in the tech ecosystem right now in most companies. But in design and engineering, you have many different types of design, many different types of engineering, front engineering, back end engineering, DevOps, right? Like all of these types of things. And for some reason in product management, we still expect product managers to be experts in all of these different types of work. And that's just impossible. Like that's just completely impossible. And so certainly in some bigger companies, you start to see this specialization take effect. The first wave of this was growth PMs. You're starting to see things like data PMs emerge. Internal tooling and scaling PMs are becoming more common in larger companies, things like that. And so anyways, I think part of the growth problem is that it either gets bucketed as something just that like another PM should know, or that it's just like a rebranding of marketing or something of that effect. And just none of those things, I think, fully reflect the nature of the work.
Yeah, very interesting observations. I've definitely personally encountered some of those misconceptions as well. So the next question, I think you would have very relevant insights because of your experience at HubSpot, is Amplitude is also going through a similar phase to become a multi-product company. What are some examples of successful versus unsuccessful growth tactics that you've seen here for companies going through that journey?
It's a tough journey to go through. I would say, like, from my experience so going from a single product to a multi-product company is not about like tactics. It's more about strategy and organizational shift of how you enable that strategy. So the first piece of it is first just understanding why go to a multi-product company, right? And usually the answer there is like, well, we need to grow. But the first thing to understand is like there are multiple ways to potentially grow at that stage. So why establish a new product category as the thing that you are going to choose? Like I mentioned, HubSpot planted multiple seeds in multiple directions. International expansion of our current product, new product categories, as well as a new growth motion. And what all of these things were aimed at, oh, and sorry, there was a fourth category, which was Oh, add-ons and new market for our existing product. So moving up into the enterprise. So it was 4 directions that we went in. And so what all of these things were doing were fighting different types of saturation they were seeing. And there's like competitive saturation, there's channel saturation, there's just like market saturation, which like with the international expansion was aimed to fight. And so you need to understand specifically, like strategically, like why do like a new product category. Once you understand that, then you need to figure out, okay, like is it a question of I can't remember what we call this. It's either like adjacent or diversification. So adjacent would be like, I'm going to target the existing market just with a new product that solves like a new problem and a new use case. Or am I launching a new product in a fundamentally new market, right? Which is diversification. And those things are very different, and those things look very different and have different sense of implications. But the biggest mistake that I've seen, and we definitely made a little bit at HubSpot, was that whatever the new product and potentially new market is, you have to clearly understand like what are the capabilities that you are leveraging from the existing org. Because if you don't understand those things and you're not leveraging core capabilities from the existing org, that could be like technology, a specific customer acquisition channel, like something else, then it's probably going to fail. That product should probably live in a different company. And so at HubSpot, to give an example of this, this is kind of what I've written quite a bit about, which was one of the early products we went after on the sales side of things ended up just being too different. We ended up targeting a different market. So it was like more prosumer, whereas the rest of the company was targeting like mid-market. It was targeting a completely new value prop, a completely new growth motion, like everything was new about it. And so you look at that and you say, well, like if it's not leveraging anything, like why should this exist within HubSpot? And so we got to a year into a few million in ARR, and where the friction started to appear, it was like, well, like how are we going to roll these things back into the company? How are we going to leverage the rest of the company to continue to add acceleration to this? Our customers are confused because they don't know if this product is for them or not. Or like all of this friction point came in. And so we had to reorient the strategy around leveraging the thing that HubSpot knew really well, which was selling into the mid-market. So we reconstructed the target audience, which led us to pursue different features within this new product, which led us to price it differently and all these things. But once we had all of those things aligned, it was still targeting a new product category, sales, but it was leveraging a lot of the things that we knew as a company. And as a result, that's what kind of, I think the sales product does like a couple $100 million. It got to 100 million in revenue in like half the time that the marketing product did, something like that. But that's the whole point of one of the whole points of doing new products, is that you are leveraging some core capability within your organization. So for any product teams that are working on that, you really got to look at that hard and make sure that you understand like what set of things you're leveraging and what set of new things are you inventing. And if the answer to that is I'm inventing almost everything here, then you're probably chasing down a path that's not a good one. In my opinion, there's very few examples of that succeeding, and in those examples, they tend to be way later in the life cycle, like not 100 million in revenue, like $1 billion in revenue. Like I'm talking like AWS, for Amazon, something like that. So anyways, I think that's the biggest thing. And then the last thing is just how you structure the teams and enable the org to pursue these new opportunities in a way that gives them the room to invent new things, because there's the reverse problem, which is that you don't change enough of the elements to actually establish a new product category. So the mistakes can go in both directions. Too much innovation and too little innovation.
given we have 17 minutes left, maybe one more question, which I think you already alluded to in your previous answer, is for companies going through the phase of going from 100 million ARR to 1 billion, what are the trends that you've seen that make that journey successful? And what characterize the companies that have been able to do it?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, sorry, yeah, maybe I misunderstood the question before, but yeah, that was kind of what I was just talking about. But I think that the main, I don't know if I can draw any conclusions on the characteristics, but I would just, I would encourage saying like doing the exercise of like, where do we want to be 4 to 5 years from now, and working backwards to like the things that are working today, like how far do you think those things can get you to that goal, what the delta is, and then like what are the possible pathways to start to fill that delta. And as part of that is like, remember 100% of things are not going to work. Just because you have a lot more people, a lot more resources, time, like all of that, like money, like all of that kind of stuff, doesn't mean the bets are going to work out, right? And so you have to place multiple bets and expect, you know, a couple of them to lose, which definitely happened at HubSpot. And so as part of that too is like, once again, you might have more people, you might have more money, but you cannot skip steps through the product development. You still have to find product market fit. And once you find product market fit, figure out how you can go through those steps faster because you have more resources, but you can't skip steps. Skipping steps kind of leads to just like basically bad products that actually don't help you like fill the gaps.
Awesome. So now we'll open up for audience Q&A. So if you have any question, I see a couple in the chat. Feel free to just unmute and then jump in.
Yeah, I can ask mine since I had it there. Hey, Brian, thanks for taking time to come chat with us. Really insightful stuff. I love your work at Reforge, obviously. And yeah, hopefully, we can continue working together with you guys on lots of stuff going forward. I had a question about you were mentioning the skill economy and how people tend to these days end up collecting skills versus applying them to problems and learning them for maybe more practical purposes. I fully agree with the premise. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, like what is causing those trends and such. One of the hard things that I've observed when you kind of assume that is that evaluating people on whether they're going to be good in some role. There's like a lot of ways to do that. I guess skill-based honestly feels like one of the maybe better ways to do that because it's probably slightly less biased. It's probably more aligned to like what you're actually looking for. But at the same time, it's a little bit potentially in conflict with this understanding that people collecting skills don't necessarily reflect them actually being able to do things in practice. Yeah, I was just wondering if you've thought about this at all, if you found anything that seems more effective. Yeah.
It's definitely tough. Like, I think one of the big things that needs to shift so first of all, I think our current system creates more inequality, right? Especially when you think about certification and credentialing, right? That 100% leads to more inequality at the moment. And one of the reasons that I think it just like needs to fundamentally just get put in the garbage. But the problem is what you're describing is on the other side, is that the whole ecosystem basically has all of these ways that they evaluate talent, and like whether you like it or not, what recruiters are doing inside the big companies is they are scanning resumes for these signals, these credentials, and doing some quick filtering in most companies. And the problem is that what somebody looks like they're capable of on paper and what they're actually capable of, that delta is just like growing, and it grows in both directions. People that look like they're more capable than they actually are on paper, and the vice versa, people who are actually way more capable in real life than they look like on paper. And so like it's a really hard problem to solve, and I don't really have the answer for it. At Reforge, we do all problem solving based interviewing. So we give a scenario. We basically give a scenario where we expect them to show us their thought process and structure to solving the problem. We don't We don't look at the answer, the solution. We ask them to detail out like how they approach solving the problem, and then we dig into that structure and approach, and we basically purely hire off of that. Better is if they actually have a portfolio of work that they've done in prior companies, and we will also like interview and based on that as well. And that's how I've made all of my best hires historically. So this conversation was actually with a guy that I hired historically at HubSpot based on this. His name is Scott Tousley. He's now the head of head of user acquisition at HubSpot. But I had to fight to hire him because on resume he didn't have the sexy credentials, and he was remote, and we were not a remote company at the time. But his work at his previous company that he showed me, and his work during the interview process was so good that I like wanted to take a risk on him, and he ended up being one of the best hires I've ever made. It's just that, yeah, like those types of evaluation systems need to definitely need to shift, and as they shift, it'll encourage people more to take this approach of more of like a portfolio versus resume and stop chasing the credentials and stuff. But like both things need to happen. So but you're right, it's a deep, complex problem with like many different sides to it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing.
I had a question actually. I think you answered a bunch of I had a question in chat, and my name is Kelvin. Nice to meet you. But I had a question, and I think you answered a bunch of it. But one thing I wanted to ask more specifically from that list was, as you were starting to build out Reforge, and as you were starting to instruct the first set of courses, what were the major learning points for your team? What things didn't work, or what things worked better than you expected?
Good question. So I don't think this is going to be a satisfying answer for you because it's not typical, which is that in the early days, like I would say like 80 to 90% of everything we tried just worked. And which is rare, believe me. Like it was not, it was, you know, like we approached it after the MVP and I was like, well, you know, can we run this program a second time, or was it a one-time fluke? And we ran it a second time and it was bigger than the first time. And then we were like, well, can we develop a second program, and like, will it be of equal popularity? And that's when we did the retention program with Casey Winters and Sean Klaus. That worked. That was bigger than the growth series. And then we were like, well, maybe let's do a more advanced program, and like that thing worked. Like, so like all of those things worked essentially along the day. And so we were very fortunate from that perspective. I do think the one mistake that we made, and I talk a lot about now, is that in those first 2 years, I think we spent way too much time chasing, like reacting and trying to improve to like the small set of complaints that we did have from users. That just led to a game of whack-a-mole of things that like, even though we tried a million things, it just none of them moved the needle. And I think we had the realization at the end of the day, what really was going on behind the scenes is that they just weren't our target audience. But they didn't know that. They weren't going to say that, right? And if we asked them that, they weren't going to tell us, right? So it was like very indirect, and we had way better results by just doubling down on the things that like we're already working and looking for ways to improve those things. And so we've been trying to do more and more of that the past 2 years, is continue to double down on those things. But it shows the danger of this, I would call it like a religion around like lean product development, which is like build the prototype, get feedback, you know, respond to the complaints. It's actually just way more nuanced than that. And typically you have, as a company, like way more ceiling room to grow in by creatively thinking about things you can double down on and create more of, versus like constantly like fixing the holes. So and then, sorry to leave you with the framework, there's Tom Tunga's who's a VC at Redpoint, wrote this great blog post on categorizing product work as I forget the buckets, but it was like differentiation, and then there is like things that get you to like minimum, like the must needs for the market, and like some other things. And he talks about all the reasons why product features in the differentiation bucket rarely get prioritized, even though they create better results. I'll find it afterwards and I'll send it over to Andrea.
Thanks, that was helpful.
Any other questions?
Hey, Brian. Thanks for sharing. I saw Reforge take some funding. Can you talk more? What's the future in your mind for Reforge? I kind of surprised, like Reforge take some funding.
Tell me more about that. Why were you surprised?
Like I just look at the like the products is like courses, like teaching people like how to be better at like growth and product management, like such kind of stuff. Like in nature, like I think that's like small market, and like I don't know like what's the plan for the future. So that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I think so I started the company. I did not know whether or not it was going to be a big company or not. Like that was just like that was a big, and that's why I didn't take funding. I had raised a bunch of VC money in my prior companies. I kind of knew the pros and the cons and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so my mentality has always been like capital is just a means to an end. So like if there is some end that we see that we want to get to on some timeline that we just can't fund with the cash flow of the business, then we'll go out and raise funding. And so for the first 3 to 4 years first 4 years of the company, like the answer to that question was we were always able to fund the things that we wanted to do with the cash flow of the business. But there was a point in the company where that flipped. And so and the few things that flipped were a couple things. One was that we had figured out a bunch of things internally, specifically around our growth engine of how to create more programs repeatably. And we could see a roadmap of like 100 different programs within the tech ecosystem that we could potentially build. And then 2 was like the acquisition engine. We started to see a lot more virality in forms of like word of mouth, and we could see like how we could double down on those 2 things. And so all of a sudden the answer became, well, there's a bunch of things we want to build on a timeline that we can't fund with the company. And so we had to, and then on top of that, COVID just threw just like crazy amounts of fuel onto this segment of the market in like the competitive environment and all that kind of stuff. So anyways, the answer to that question, the equation flipped. And so that's when we had to make a very specific choice. Like, do we want to do this or not? Because it is a one-way door. And so maybe it feels like a small market, but we see a path to how to develop programs across every function within technology and other industry. And so you consider like 70 billion is spent on corporate training, and only 30% of L&D budgets go used on average, which means like the true potential is actually like a multiple of that. And most products have very low satisfaction rates within companies as well. So like that's the other thing. So
I see.
It ended up being a pretty large market, but we just haven't we haven't done the TechCrunch articles. We haven't done like those types of things. And that's just my personal philosophy of like why we haven't done those things. And like we've been focused on other things, but I think it took a lot of people by surprise. You're not the only one.
I see. Do you plan to expand to like other, I guess, roles or like functionality?
Yeah, so we started planting seeds in engineering already. So we went from growth, if you consider that a function, which goes back to the earlier question, but let's not open that Pandora's box again, into core products. So we like product strategy, user insights. We have 3 or 4 more core product programs coming out for this fall. And then we started planting seeds in engineering with a program called Scaling Product Delivery. It's about how to deliver big product bets like this new product category that you're alluding to, like how to do that. And we'll have a couple more engineering focused programs coming out later this year. So so that's kind of our next target, with all of the others on the roadmap, but you'll see more from us around that.
Cool. Thanks for sharing.
All right, I think we are at time. Brian, it's been amazing having you here, and thanks for all your great insights.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Feel free to reach out to me at any point. So just, yeah, B Balfour at Reforge. And yeah, Amplitude is a great product. Keep up the good work.